A woman standing on the tracks as a train bears down on her. A man who hasn't spoken his real name in 2 years. A land stolen by the most powerful railroad in the West. And somewhere in the hills of Utah, a missing accountant who knows enough to destroy them all. What happens next will cost everything and give back something neither of them expected. This is a story about what happens when two people carrying the same wound find each other and discover that justice, like land, is worth fighting for together. Welcome to a channel where the West is more than dust and gunfire. It's fathers and daughters, strangers who become family, and the quiet courage of people who refuse to let the truth be buried. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment below. Like and share it with someone who believes good people still win in the end. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We're just getting started.
Wade Callahan had known the approximate mile marker for 2 years. He stood on the roof of the Triple Bar stable in the dark before dawn, watching the Union Pacific cut its bright line through the valley below. And he thought about it the way a man thinks about a sore tooth. Not constantly, but always there when the mind went quiet. Somewhere under that iron and gravel, under the weight of progress and eminent domain and all the polite language men used when they took what belonged to someone else, was a piece of ground his father had farmed for 30 years. He knew the mile marker. He had never gone to look. The sun came up slow over the Wasatch Range, pushing orange light across the red dust of Ogden, Utah, September of 1878. Below him, the ranch was waking, horses moving in the paddocks, smoke beginning from the cookhouse chimney, the distant sound of a water pump working. Wade watched the last of the train lights disappear south and climbed down from the roof. He had things to do. He always had things to do. That was the point. Ogden in September smelled of coal smoke and cattle, and something underneath both of those things that might have been ambition or might have been desperation, and a man who had lived here long enough understood they were close cousins. Wade had lived here 2 years, he understood. He rode into town that afternoon for fence wire. Patterson, the ranch owner, was sick in his bed and getting worse, and the north fence line needed 200 yards of new wire before winter came down off the mountains. It was routine work. Wade preferred routine. He had arranged his entire life in Ogden around the principle of routine, and it had served him well enough. No trouble, no entanglements, no events. The train station sat at the west end of Main Street, and as Wade tied his horse outside the hardware merchant, he heard the afternoon Union Pacific come in. The long scream of brakes, the hiss of released steam, the particular chaos of a platform receiving passengers and mail and freight all at once. He was not watching the platform. He was reading the merchant's list in his coat pocket. Then someone shouted. Wade looked up. A woman was standing on the tracks. Not on the platform. Not stepping off a car. Standing on the rails themselves, 20 yards from the still-moving engine. And she was not looking at the train. She was looking at something on the far side of the platform. Her body turned at an angle that made it clear she had simply stopped registering where her feet were. She was tracking something, or someone. The train was not her concern because she had not yet made it her concern, and by the time she did, it would be too late. Wade did not think. He ran. He hit her from the side, and they went down together onto the gravel between the rails and the platform edge, rolling twice, coming to rest against the wood pilings as the engine thundered past close enough that the displaced air pressed flat against them both. Wade felt gravel against his palms and the solid weight of another person and the deep vibration of several tons of iron moving through the earth. Then it was past. The noise receded. The dust settled. He got to his feet and steadied her. She found her balance quickly, quicker than most people did after something like that, which told him something. His eyes went to her hands without deciding to. Smooth. No calluses. Nails cut straight, but not the cut of a woman who scrubbed floors or mended harness or did any of the 100 rough things a working woman's hand showed. The skin of someone who had spent her life with documents and pens, and the kind of indoor labor that left no mark. She was lying before she opened her mouth. He did not yet know what the lie was. She looked back at the far side of the platform first, scanning. Then she turned to him. "Did you see a man in a brown vest?" "Not, thank you." "Not, are you hurt?" Not even a breath to settle herself. She wanted to know about the man in the brown vest. "No," Wade said. She accepted this, seemed to file it somewhere, and then became a different version of herself. The version that had been on the train and was now arriving in Ogden and was grateful to the man who had pulled her clear of the rails. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you. I lost track of where I was standing." Her voice was steady. Her breathing was even. A woman who had nearly died 30 seconds ago and was handling it the way someone handled a minor inconvenience. That told him something, too. "Nell Harper," she said, and offered her hand. He shook it. Smooth palm. No grip from years of reins or rope or fence work. "Wade Callahan." "Are you from Ogden, Mr. Callahan?" "Work outside of town, Triple Bar Ranch." "And the town itself, yeah? Have you been here long?" The question started there and did not stop. As he walked her toward Emma Cross's boarding house, because Western courtesy required it and because he had nowhere specific to be, she asked about the town, the people, the land north of Ogden, the Continental Pacific construction project that had survey crews working the valley for the past 8 months. Smart questions, organized questions, the kind a person asked when they had already done their reading and wanted the reading confirmed by someone with local knowledge, not what a substitute teacher from Denver would ask. He answered in short sentences and listened to how she framed her inquiries. A man who had spent 2 years as a scout for the Army learned the difference between curiosity and intelligence gathering. This was the second thing. Emma Cross ran the best boarding house in Ogden, which was not saying a great deal, but she ran it honestly and kept her opinions about her guests' business entirely to herself, which was worth considerably more. She was 67 years old, had white hair pinned back with the efficiency of a woman who had given up on appearances in favor of function, and she read people the way a tracker read ground. Not by thinking about it, but by simply looking and knowing. She took one look at Nell Harper and began moving toward the kitchen to put water on. As Wade prepared to leave, Emma appeared in the hallway and drew him aside. Her voice was low and without any particular drama. "That woman is not a school teacher. I know. I know school teacher eyes. Those are hunting eyes." He nodded, went back to the hardware merchant, got his fence wire, rode back to the ranch. He told himself he was thinking about the fence. He thought about the fence for approximately 20 minutes of the hour-long ride. The remaining 40 minutes he spent turning over the questions she had asked and the order she had asked them in, and the particular quality of her attention when he answered. He did not sleep well that night, and it was not the old nightmare. The old nightmare had a shape he knew. This was something else. Not dread, not exactly. More like the feeling before weather arrived, when the air itself changed and told a man something was coming. He lay in his narrow bed in the ranch cabin and looked at the dark ceiling. He thought about smooth hands and hunting eyes. In her room at Emma's boarding house 3 miles south. Nell Harper opened a leather satchel and spread a hand-drawn map across the bed. The land parcels surrounding Ogden were marked in red ink, each one numbered and cross-referenced against a list she had memorized 2 months ago. She studied the map for a long time, tracing a boundary line with her finger. One name had been circled at the map's northern edge. Jacob Reeves, last known location, Triple Bar Ranch. She looked out the window toward the hills, dark now against a darker sky. "Where did you go, Jacob?" she said quietly. It was not a question. It was the thing she had come here to answer. 3 days into Ogden, and Nell Harper had her cover well established. She taught school in the mornings at the small building on Cedar Street, where the regular teacher, a woman named Parsons, had gone east for a family illness and left 22 children in the care of whoever the school board could find on short notice. Nell had offered her services the morning after she arrived, producing credentials from her leather satchel with the practiced ease of a woman who had prepared her documents carefully. She taught well. This surprised her. She had taught herself to read on her father's library and had always assumed the ability to learn something did not translate to the ability to convey it. But the children in Ogden paid attention in a way that suggested they were unaccustomed to being spoken to, as if their understanding mattered, and she found herself working harder than the cover required. Afternoons, she moved through town. She asked questions about the land north of Ogden at the general store, framing them as a newcomer's curiosity about the country. She had coffee at the hotel dining room and listened to the railroad men talk among themselves. She walked the length of Main Street slowly on a Tuesday and noted which businesses had Continental Pacific contracts posted in their windows. On Wednesday, she was in the general store asking the owner about the parcel boundaries along the northern valley, when she became aware of a stillness at the far end of the counter that had not been there a moment before. Wade Callahan was buying tobacco and had stopped in the process of paying for it. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the tobacco tin. But he had stopped moving, which meant he was listening, which meant he had heard enough of her question to register it as something worth hearing. She filed this away and finished her conversation with the store owner and left. 40 minutes later, outside the saloon on the east side of Maine, a man named Purvis, who had been drinking since before noon, decided that a woman walking alone was an invitation to commentary. He blocked her path on the board sidewalk and offered several observations about her appearance and her probable situation that were meant to be charming, and were not. Wade came around the corner. He did not move fast. He stopped 3 feet from Purvis and said something in a voice too low for Nell to hear, and Purvis looked at his face and stepped back and found somewhere else to be. Wade watched him go with the same expression he had brought to the situation, neither warm nor cold, simply the expression of a man who had assessed a problem and resolved it, and was now thinking about what came next. "You always show up at the right time," Nell said. "Or is that a habit?" "I don't like my town disturbed." She noted the word. Not the town, my town. A man who had arrived here 2 years ago and had no property and no official standing had staked a claim in the only currency available to him. The currency of a man who showed up when things went wrong. That was worth knowing about him. She thanked him briefly, the way one adult acknowledged another's competence, and continued down the street. Behind the Triple Bar stable that same afternoon, a man named Sam Briggs found Wade and delivered news that had been brought in by a railroad worker Sam knew from a Mexican family out on the North Range. A Continental Pacific survey crew had begun staking land parcels along the Northern Valley boundary, ground that several small ranchers believed was still under active title dispute. The company was moving before any legal challenge could be organized. "Not our business," Wade said. Sam Briggs was 38 years old, built like a man who had done hard work in every climate and had stopped being surprised by any of it, with a Tennessee drawl he had not lost in 15 years away from home. He had fought for the Confederacy in the war and would not apologize for it, and did not expect anyone to thank him for it either, and those were the only terms on which he and Wade had ever discussed the matter. Sam looked at Wade with the patience of a man who understood when another man was lying to himself. "They're staking through the range your daddy used to work," Sam said. "Figured you ought to know that part." Wade said nothing. His jaw set in a particular way that Sam had seen twice before, once outside Laramie and once in a line camp east of Salt Lake, and both times something had gotten broken before the evening was done. "Just thought you ought to know," Sam said, and went back to work. That afternoon, Wade checked the north fence line alone. The fence was fine. That was not why he was there. He found the tracks at the property's north edge, half hidden in the dry grass near the tree line. Shod horse standing still for a while. The ground was pressed deeper in the center of each print than at the edges. Then the tracks moved east along the tree line and disappeared into the timber. One shoe was worn slightly on the left rear, creating a distinctive mark in the softer ground near a creek crossing. Someone had stood here and watched the ranch. Recently, within the last few days. Wade studied the tracks for a long time. Then he noted them, filed them, and went back to work. That evening at the community supper, held every second Wednesday at the church hall, Nell Harper found a seat beside Wade Callahan with the deliberate positioning of a chess player who had been thinking 3 moves ahead since Tuesday. Wade recognized the positioning and said nothing about it. "Mr. Callahan, I hear Triple Bar has been looking for someone to teach the ranch workers' children." He looked at her for a moment. "Haven't heard that." "You just did." She smiled. It was not the smile of a woman being charming. It was the smile of a woman placing a bet and knowing the odds. Wade arranged it the next morning. 3 days a week, 2 hours each visit, for the 6 children belonging to Triple Bar's married workers. Patterson's foreman thought it was a fine idea. Wade told himself he had done it because it was a reasonable thing to do, and because Emma Cross had mentioned that Nell seemed like a capable woman who could use steady work. He had done it because something was wrong around her, and he wanted to know what it was before anyone else did. She was hunting something at Triple Bar Ranch. He intended to know what that something was. Nell taught her first session that Thursday. On her way out, she stopped at the general store for flour and thread. And while Emma was wrapping her order, Emma mentioned something to the woman behind Nell in a conversational way, not directed at anyone in particular. A man had come through the boarding house a few weeks ago asking about Cole Deering. Sat at the counter, drank his coffee slow, asked careful questions, left without giving his name. Broad through the shoulders, Emma said, quiet the way some men got quiet. The kind of quiet that came from having seen things a person did not discuss in polite company. The woman behind Nell nodded and forgot it before she reached the door. Nell bought her flour and walked back to the boarding house thinking about a broad-shouldered man asking about Cole Deering and about horse tracks on the north fence line of a ranch where a missing accountant had last been seen, and about the way a place could hold more secrets than its size suggested. Ogden was a small town. Small towns were useful because everything was visible. Small towns were dangerous for the same reason. She was good with the children. That part was not cover. Nell Harper stood at the front of the makeshift classroom in the Triple Bar cookhouse. 3 long tables pushed together, 6 children ranging from 7 to 14 years old, chalk and a borrowed board propped against the wall. And she taught the way her father's tutors had taught her, which was to say, she treated every question as if it deserved a serious answer, and every child as if they were capable of understanding the serious answer. The older ones were suspicious of her at first, the wariness of children who had been condescended to by well-meaning adults. By the second hour, they were arguing with each other about the answers. That was the sign of genuine engagement, and Nell recognized it and pushed harder. Wade watched from the cookhouse doorway for 10 minutes, then went back to work. He had seen what he needed to see. At noon, when the children broke for their midday meal, Nell walked east toward the cluster of older outbuildings at the back of the ranch property. She moved without hurry, the way a person moved when they had every right to be where they were going. The old equipment shed stood at the property's east edge, half its roof replaced with newer wood, the rest still the original weathered gray of 30-year-old timber. A woman named Clara, who took in laundry for the Triple Bar crew, had mentioned in conversation 2 days ago that the previous bookkeeper had kept his records in that shed because the main office had no room. The previous bookkeeper had been Jacob Reeves. She was 4 steps from the shed door when she became aware of being followed. She did not stop. She walked the remaining 4 steps, put her hand on the door latch, and said without turning, "You've been behind me since the 3rd stable. You stepped on gravel at the 4th step." A pause. Then boots on dry ground, approaching without concealment now. "What are you looking for?" She turned. Wade Callahan stood 8 feet away, and he was watching her with the particular stillness of a man who had already made up his mind that he was going to have an honest conversation and was waiting for the other person to catch up. "Do you know a man named Jacob Reeves?" Something moved in his expression, and was still again almost immediately. "Why are you asking?" "Because he works for me. And he's gone." They looked at each other in the September heat, the smell of old wood and dry grass between them, and Nell made the calculation she had been making since the day before. The one about whether this man was the kind of man the information was safe with. She had gotten good at that calculation over 3 years of managing her father's estate. She was not always right, but she was right more often than not. She was right about this one. She could feel it in the way he had stopped moving, the quality of his attention. This was a man who knew how to hold what he was given. "His name is Jacob Reeves," she said. "He was chief accountant for Hartwell Holdings. It's a land and mineral company with operations across the territory. 6 months ago, Jacob found evidence that someone was forging land transfer documents, moving parcels out of the company's holdings and into shell companies connected to a railroad. He sent me a letter. Then he came to Ogden to investigate further. And then he stopped writing." "What company?" "Continental Pacific Railroad." Wade held her gaze for a moment. Then he pushed the shed door open. "Come inside." The shed smelled of oil and iron and the particular dry mustiness of a space used for storage and then forgotten. Old equipment along the walls, chains hanging from ceiling hooks, a workbench along the back wall with nothing on it but a thin layer of dust. And the dust on the workbench was not entirely undisturbed. Wade saw it at the same moment she did, a slight disturbance in the far corner of the bench surface, a different thickness, as if something had been placed there and moved recently. He moved to the wall beside the bench and began working his fingers along the boards, not randomly, with the systematic patience of a man who knew how buildings hid things. Nell watched his hands. He pressed one board, then another, then found the loose one 2 feet from the corner and eased it away from the wall. A ledger book, narrow, bound in brown leather, slid forward. They took it to the workbench and read it together. The numbers were organized and meticulous. Jacob had always been meticulous. And they told a clear story. 23 land parcels, transfer dates spanning 18 months, authorizing signatures on forged documents. And at the end of each transfer chain, one name appeared: Grove Aldrich, Continental Pacific Holdings. Nell breathed out slowly. Her hand moved toward the book. Wade's hand was already on her wrist, not gripping, just stopping. "Wait. I found what I came for. Look again." She looked at him. His face was careful in a way that was different from his normal careful. This was the careful of a man who had been trained to notice what other people missed. "The dust," he said quietly. She looked at the workbench. The dust disturbance around the hidden board was not the disturbance of one visit. It was the disturbance of multiple visits. Careful repositioning. A board replaced and opened and replaced again. Someone had been here after Jacob left it. "Turn the book over," Wade said. She turned it over. The back cover had a slight thickness to the binding. Not much, barely noticeable. But Wade's fingers found the edge of something tucked inside the binding and worked it free. A folded piece of paper, dense handwriting on both sides. She recognized Jacob's hand before she finished the first line. He had written it in the formal accounting style he used for everything. Clear, organized, each sentence complete. It said, "If you found this record, you found what they wanted you to find. The true evidence is elsewhere and in better hands. Do not trust this document as proof. Do not trust anyone in Ogden who led you here, including the person standing beside you when you read these words. They knew you were coming before you arrived. Someone told them. I do not know who. Be careful." Nell read it twice. Then she looked up at Wade Callahan. He was reading the note over her shoulder, and his expression had gone still in a particular way. Not the stillness of guilt, not the stiffness of a man caught doing something wrong. The stillness of a man absorbing new information that changed the shape of what he already knew. He stepped back from the bench, stood in the middle of the shed floor. "Someone set this up before you arrived," he said. "Yes." "That means they knew you were coming." "Yes." "Which means someone in your organization sent word ahead." He looked at her. "Someone you told about this trip." She had told 3 people. Jacob was already gone when she left. Her lawyer knew only that she was traveling on business. And Marcus Webb, her financial manager, had been given the general outline of her plan because she needed him to manage the San Francisco office while she was away. She kept her face still and her voice even. "That's one possibility. What's the other?" "That they've had someone watching my operation for longer than I realized." She looked at the note again. "Jacob warned me not to trust anyone who led me to this. That would include you." "It would," Wade agreed. He did not appear troubled by the statement. "But Jacob didn't know who he was warning me about. He wrote this before he knew who would find the book." "That's right. So the warning applies to everyone equally." "It does." She looked at him for a long moment. The dust in the air, the smell of old iron. The ledger book sitting on the bench between them, a trap carefully laid by someone who had known she was coming, and had known approximately when she would arrive, and had known enough about her to know she would come to the equipment shed eventually. "We should put it back exactly as we found it," she said. "Agreed." They replaced the book, replaced the loose board, left the shed separately, 3 minutes apart, walking in different directions. Wade went back to the north fence line and worked until sundown, pulling old wire and setting new posts, the mechanical work of a man who needed his hands busy while his mind went somewhere else. He thought about Jacob Reeves, who had been at this ranch 6 months ago and had left without notice and had not been heard from since. He thought about the land transfer list in that ledger, and the name that appeared at the end of every chain. He thought about another list, one he had never actually seen but had spent 5 years trying to reconstruct from county records and second-hand accounts. Grove Aldrich. He knew that name. He had known it for 5 years, in the way a man knew the name of someone he had not yet found the proof to face. He set a fence post in the ground and tamped it firm with the post driver, and the rhythmic impact of iron on iron carried down the valley and faded. That evening he sat in his cabin and cleaned his revolver. He had done this every night since the war, not because the revolver needed cleaning every night, but because the ritual of maintenance was a kind of control in the absence of other control, and the war had left him with a permanent need for something he could maintain. He thought about the name in the ledger. He thought about the name on a land office record he had found 5 years ago in a Wyoming county clerk's office, the record that said Thomas Callahan had sold Lot 47 North Range to Continental Pacific Holdings, and the date on that record, and the date on his father's headstone, and the 3 weeks that separated them. He had told himself for 5 years that he did not have enough proof. He thought about that, too. Outside his window, a rider sat motionless a half-mile out in the dark. The horse was still. The rider was watching the cabin light. After 10 minutes, horse and rider moved east along the tree line and were gone. Wade saw them go. He had been watching the window from the corner of his eye since he sat down. The worn left rear shoe showing in the moonlight as they crossed a patch of pale ground near the tree line. The same horse, the same rider, watching the ranch again. He set the revolver on the table beside the lamp and sat with his hands flat on the table. Something was gathering around Ogden, the way weather gathered over the Wasatch before it came down into the valley. Not visible yet in full, but the pressure of it already changing the air. He knew what that felt like. He had felt it once before, in a Tennessee valley in September of '63, and every man in his company had felt it too, and they had been right about what it meant. He blew out the lamp and sat in the dark and let his eyes adjust, watching the tree line. Nothing moved again that night, but the feeling did not leave. Wade found her the next morning before she found him. This was unusual enough that he noticed it as he walked to the boarding house. In 2 years in Ogden, he had not deliberately sought out another person's company. He had responded when people sought him, because courtesy required it. He had helped when help was needed because his father had raised him to. But going looking, that was a different thing. He noticed it and set it aside and knocked on Emma Cross's door. Emma let him in without comment, which meant she had been expecting him, which meant she was ahead of both of them already, as she generally was. Nell was at the kitchen table with coffee. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the equipment shed, the steady, measuring look of someone deciding what the available information meant. He sat down across from her. "I know this land," he said. "The terrain north of town, the parcel boundaries, which ranchers have been having trouble. I know the people, who sells information and who keeps it. I know the county land records from 5 years of reading them every time I could get to Salt Lake City." He paused. "You know the documents, the legal structure, how the railroad shell companies are organized. Together we can see the whole picture. Separately we can see half of it." Nell set her coffee cup down. "Why would you help me?" "Because I have reasons to know that land." She waited. He did not elaborate. She asked him 3 questions about the North Valley geography, the kind that required specific knowledge, the exact location of the old survey markers, which creek crossings were usable in high water, where the Hartwell Holdings boundary ran in relation to the Continental Pacific Survey stakes. He answered all 3 without hesitation, and without the slight pause of a man constructing an answer from general knowledge. "You know that country like your own property," she said. "I have reasons to know it," he said again. She accepted this. They went to work. They rode north together that morning, Nell with her map case and Wade with the territory in his head from 5 years of deliberate study. She cross-referenced her documents against the actual terrain, and he confirmed or corrected each reference point from knowledge. It was not a pleasant task. The picture that emerged as they worked was methodical and patient and thorough, in the way that large crimes were, when the men committing them had money and time and the cooperation of enough county officials to feel comfortable moving slowly. The land was being absorbed, not seized outright. That would invite immediate legal challenge. Bought out, at prices calculated to be just high enough to seem fair, and just low enough to leave the seller with nothing to argue in court. Applied pressure where purchase failed. Rumors of legal complications with existing titles, sudden enforcement of dormant debt obligations, a pattern of small harassments that made a man feel that his hold on his own ground was less certain than he had believed. And where pressure failed, accidents. Not frequent because frequent attracted attention. Occasional. Enough to make a point. They stopped at the Donahue place mid-morning. The family was gone. The house had been empty for 6 months, the garden gone to seed, the barn door hanging open on one hinge. Continental Pacific Survey stakes marked the property's new boundary, freshly painted, running along a line that had recently been part of a working family's front pasture. 3 children, Wade said, looking at the empty house. Worked this place for 6 years. Took a buyout offer 6 months ago, month after their barn burned. Nell said nothing. She looked at the survey stakes. "The Reyes family was east of here," he said. "Been here since before Utah was a territory. They're gone now, too. Somewhere in New Mexico, last anyone heard. How many families like this? I stopped counting." They rode on. An hour later, they came across Thomas Garrett at his fence line, 63 years old, working alone with wire and pliers, trying to repair a section that had come down in last week's wind. His hired hand had quit the week before. 2 Continental Pacific men had come by and offered the hand better wages to come work on the survey crew. Thomas had thanked them politely for coming by and had been fighting his fence line alone since Monday. Wade dismounted without being asked. He took the wire stretcher from Thomas's hand and went to work. Thomas made coffee on his camp stove and brought it out in tin cups, and Nell sat on the fence rail and listened to Thomas talk about his land, the way men talked about things they had been given by their fathers and intended to pass to their sons. His wife was buried in the east corner under the cottonwood he had planted for her in '67. His son had died at Cold Harbor in '64. Thomas had worked this ground alone since then. "Man came by last week," Thomas said, watching Wade pull the wire tight. Nice enough fellow, said Continental Pacific was prepared to offer a fair price, given the legal complications with the Northern Boundary Survey. What legal complications? Nell asked. That was my question, too. He didn't have a clear answer. Said it was something to look into, that the company could save me the trouble by taking the land off my hands before it became a court matter. Nell looked at her map. Thomas Garrett's parcel had a clean title going back to 1862. She knew because she had read the county records on every parcel in the valley before she came here. Tell him no if he comes back, she said. Thomas looked at her. He said there were others who'd said no, and regretted it. Tell him no, she said again quietly with the tone of someone who had already worked out the situation and was now simplifying the answer to its essential form. And if anything happens to your property after that, you come find me at Emma Cross's boarding house before you find the sheriff. Thomas looked at Wade. Wade was pulling wire and not commenting. Thomas nodded slowly. They rode back south in the early afternoon, near the creek crossing where they had stopped on the way out. Nell's horse picked up a stone in his right front hoof and began to favor it. They dismounted, and Wade worked the stone free with his pocket knife while Nell sat on a boulder and watched the water. You were a soldier, she said, long time ago. The way you move, the way you check the exits of every building you walk into. You never sit with your back to a door. He looked up from the hoof. You do the same thing. A moment passed. Neither of them said anything about it. But the air between them changed in the particular way it changed when two people recognized something in each other that they had not expected to find. They rode back to Ogden. That evening, sitting at the small desk in her room at Emma's boarding house, Nell wrote a brief letter to Marcus Webb in San Francisco. She updated him on her progress. She had made contact in Ogden, was gathering information about the land transfers Jacob had flagged, expected to have a clearer picture within the week. Standard correspondence. She sealed it and gave it to Emma to post in the morning. Webb had managed Hartwell Holdings' day-to-day operations since her father's death. He was careful, competent, and thorough. She had trusted him with the entire operation while she was away, because there was no one else she trusted with it, which was the kind of situation a person in her position was always in. Authority narrow enough that absence was a risk, but presence was required. She did not think about the letter further. Sam found Wade outside the stable at dusk. 2 Continental Pacific Survey men had been at the saloon that afternoon, asking about Nell Harper. Not about the investigation, about her. When she had arrived, where she was staying, when she left the boarding house in the mornings, and when she came back. Wade did not tell Nell that evening. Old instinct. Gather what you have before you decide what it means. If he told her now, she might change her movements before he understood why her movements were being watched, and then he would know less. He told himself this was the practical calculation. It was also true. But he lay awake again that night, thinking about men who asked where a woman slept and at what time she came and went. He knew what kind of men asked those questions, and he knew what they asked them for. He was 19 years old, and the sun was coming through the east kitchen window of the farmhouse on Lot 47, North Range, Wyoming, making the dust visible in the air the way it always did on September mornings. His father stood at the table with the folded deed in his hands, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who believed in being prepared for things he did not believe were going to happen. Thomas Callahan set the deed on the table and pressed it flat with the heel of his hand. That's the title to this place, he said. Anything happens to me while you're away, you take that to Attorney Harlan Moore in Salt Lake City. You hear me, Wade? Nothing's going to happen to you. I know that. Take it anyway. Wade took it. He put it in his kit and shipped out 3 days later with the 15th Ohio Infantry. And he carried it through 2 years of war and brought it home intact. And when he came home, his father was 3 months in the ground, and the county record said Thomas Callahan had sold Lot 47, North Range, to Continental Pacific Holdings for fair market value, and Harlan Moore had retired to California. He had spent 3 years pulling at that thread. The thread went cold, The proof was not there in any form a county court would accept. 5 years ago, he had stopped pulling at it. He told himself it was because there was nothing to find. The truth was that finding it meant admitting what had been done to his father and what his absence had cost. And some truths were too heavy to carry until you had somewhere to set them down. He woke up in the ranch cabin with that September kitchen light still visible behind his eyes and the smell of coffee he was not making. He made the coffee. Then he rode to the main house. Patterson was worse. The doctor from town came twice a week now, and the ranch foreman ran the day-to-day operation with the careful efficiency of a man who had accepted that his employer was not going to recover and was trying to hold things together until the next chapter of the ranch's life became clear. Patterson himself was lucid in the mornings and less so by afternoon, burning through what remained of him with the focused stubbornness of a man who had things he wanted to say before he was done saying them. Wade and Nell came in the morning. Patterson lay propped against 2 pillows in the big bedroom, his color poor and his eyes still sharp, and he told them what he could in the plain way of a man for whom words had become a resource to be spent carefully. Jacob Reeves had come to him 6 months ago. Jacob had been working the Triple Bar books for 3 months by then, and had found things in the land records that did not fit, transfer documents coming through for parcels that Triple Bar had leased to small ranchers, transfers being recorded in the county office that Patterson had not authorized, and in some cases had not known about at all. Jacob had been frightened. Patterson had been frightened too, which was not a thing he was accustomed to, and his response to it had not been his best moment. He had told Jacob to run and stay hidden, and had not asked him where he was going. "I should have done more," Patterson said. "You kept him alive," Nell said. "Maybe." His eyes went to Wade. "Third drawer of the safe, behind the insurance papers. You need to see what's in there. I should have given it to you before now. I was afraid to touch it." The safe was in the study. Wade opened it. Patterson had given him the combination 2 months ago when Patterson's hands had started to be unreliable, and went through the drawers with Nell standing beside him. The third drawer, behind a folder of insurance documents, held a sealed envelope with no name on the outside. Not Patterson's handwriting. Not addressed to anyone. Sent anonymously and apparently slipped into the ranch office by someone who knew where Patterson kept his safe and knew his combination, or had access to someone who did. They took it to the desk. Inside was a document that Jacob had assembled with the careful thoroughness that characterized everything he had done for Hartwell Holdings for 20 years. A complete register of land transfers in the Northern Valley, 41 parcels, each entry recording the transfer date, the recorded grantee, the authorizing signature, and the discrepancy between the recorded transaction and what the original landowner had actually agreed to or had been told they were signing. It was the real record, the one Jacob had hidden the decoy ledger to protect. Wade read it from the top. His breathing was even. His face was still. He read with the systematic attention of a man who had learned to read documents carefully, because documents sometimes told you things that kept you alive. He was halfway through the list when he stopped. Thomas Callahan, Lot 47, North Range, Wyoming. Transfer recorded March 14, 1873. Authorization signed G. Aldrich. Thomas Callahan had died April 3, 1873, 3 weeks after the transfer was recorded. The pen and ink letters on the page were precise and small, Jacob's accountant's hand, and Wade looked at them, and the kitchen light from September of 1863 was there again behind his eyes, his father's voice saying, "You hear me, Wade," and the deed pressed flat on the kitchen table. He set the document down on Patterson's desk and stood up and walked outside. The September air was hot and dry and smelled of cattle and sage, and the far-off dust of the survey crews working north of the ranch. Wade stood in it and looked at nothing. Inside the study, Nell remained at the desk. She read the entry for Thomas Callahan. Then she did what she always did. She cross-referenced. Lot 47, North Range, Wyoming. She pulled her own map from inside her coat, the hand-drawn one she had made before leaving San Francisco, and she located the parcel. Lot 47 shared a boundary line with the northernmost edge of Hartwell Holdings, Wyoming Holdings. She looked at the boundary line. She looked at the transfer dates on the Hartwell parcels in the same column. Dates from the same 18-month window, the same method, the same authorizing name. She understood what this meant. Not only what it meant for Wade, what it meant about the scope of what Aldrich had done. Two land operations adjacent to each other, operated by two different men who had never crossed paths, and the same hand had reached into both of them, and taken until one man was dead, and the other man's daughter was sitting in a ranch house in Utah trying to understand how it had happened. She folded the map. She went outside. Wade was standing with his back to the house looking north. She stood beside him. Not close. Just present. The silence stretched. A hawk moved in wide circles over the valley below. "Your father," she said. "Yeah. Mine too." They did not look at each other. They looked at the same point on the horizon, the same empty space where the valley opened toward the mountains. But the ground they were standing on was the same ground for the first time since she had arrived in Ogden. They rode back toward town and had covered half the distance when a lone rider came out of the timber on the road's south edge and stopped in their path. 42 years old. Built like a man who had worked rough country his whole adult life and been paid to do worse than the country itself could manage. He wore a Pinkerton badge that had not been valid for at least 5 years alongside a current private contractor's credential, and he wore them both with the same flat authority that some men managed regardless of what their documentation said. "Callahan," he nodded at Wade. Then to Nell, "And you must be Miss Harper. You're younger than I figured." What he meant by that sentence was not anything about her age. What he meant was that he had been given a description and a background, and had formed an expectation, and she was younger than the expectation. He had formed the expectation before she arrived. He had known she was coming. Cole Deering talked for 2 minutes. A friendly conversation about Ogden being a peaceful town and peaceful towns being worth keeping that way, delivered in the pleasant tone of a man who had found that pleasant tones carried threats more effectively than direct ones, because they made the recipient feel the insanity of objecting to something so reasonable. Then he tipped his hat and rode south. "He knew before I arrived," Nell said. "Someone told him you were coming." That sentence settled between them like a stone in still water. She was already running it. Who had known, what she had said to whom, how far back the breach might go? Wade watched her run it and said nothing. That night, Sam found Wade at the stable and told him the Continental Pacific men had been asking about Nell Harper again. Not about the investigation, about her movements, her schedule. Wade made a decision that surprised him less than he expected. "She doesn't go anywhere alone starting now." Sam looked at him, said nothing. "Not negotiable," Wade added. Sam nodded and went to tell the hands. The next morning, Wade found Nell at breakfast and told her. "You're not my keeper," she said. "No, but I've got the same enemy you do, and 2 people live longer than one." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in his face. Not the stubbornness she expected, something more like the flat clarity of a man who had already calculated the odds and was reporting the result. "All right," she said. A week of working together had the shape of a campaign. They moved through the valley methodically, recording what they found, building the picture parcel by parcel. Nell knew the documents, the legal structure, the formal shape of the fraud. Wade knew the land, the people, and 15 years of county land office records that he had spent 5 years studying for the specific purpose of understanding what had happened to his father's ground. Together, the picture became coherent. What the audience saw in those days, because the showing mattered more than any telling, was the particular grammar of 2 people learning to work alongside each other. Wade positioned himself between Nell and any door they were not using. Nell began reading the slight shifts in his posture that meant alertness versus thought, versus the old tension that had a different quality entirely and was called something else. One evening she read aloud from a land contract written in its original legal Latin, translating as she went. And Wade sat across the table, and she looked up from the page, and he was watching her face. "You weren't listening," she said. "I was. You read Latin the way most people read English. Where did you learn that?" A pause. "My father's library." She said it simply, without elaboration, and went back to the document. But it was the first true thing she had offered about herself. Not a lie, not a performance of the cover, not a calculation. Just the plain truth of where she had come from. He did not comment on it, but he filed it alongside the smooth hands and the hunting eyes and the way she had looked back at the platform before she said thank you. And the picture of her that was forming in his mind was more fully itself with each edition. A letter arrived from Marcus Webb on Thursday morning. His reply to her update from the previous week was measured and organized in the way that everything Webb produced was measured and organized. He was the most careful man she had ever employed, which was why she had entrusted him with the whole of Hartwell Holdings while she was gone. He acknowledged her progress. He expressed concern about the escalating nature of the investigation. He suggested that it might be prudent, given the complexity of the legal situation, to engage a San Francisco attorney with specific railroad litigation experience and to pursue the matter through proper legal channels rather than through personal investigation that placed her at increasing personal risk. His reasoning was impeccable. His tone was warm and concerned. His advice was entirely sensible. And something about it was wrong. She could not have put the wrongness into a sentence that would satisfy a judge. It was something in the texture of the caution, the kind of careful that sounded like wisdom, but had underneath it the faint quality of someone guiding you away from a specific place rather than toward a general safety. She set the letter aside, did not reply, filed the unease somewhere. 3 days later, Senator Grove Aldrich arrived in Ogden by private rail car. His stated purpose was to inspect the Continental Pacific construction progress on the Northern Line. This was true. His unstated purpose was that someone in his organization had told him an investigation was proceeding in Ogden, and a man in Aldrich's position did not leave active investigations unattended. He organized a community supper at the church hall. It was a masterful piece of political work. He supplied the food from his own stores, sent personal invitations to every family in town, and arrived at exactly the moment the hall was full enough to create the impression that everyone had come to see him rather than to eat food they had not paid for. He worked the crowd with the fluency of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and found it genuinely pleasant, because Aldrich was not a man who disliked people. He liked them enormously. He simply did not allow that fondness to interfere with what he needed from them. Wade and Nell came separately and stood in different parts of the hall and watched him work. At some point during the supper, Aldrich stepped outside alone. He stood on the church steps in the dark and allowed himself 2 minutes of privacy, which was all he allowed himself these days because privacy tended to produce doubt, and doubt was a luxury he had eliminated from his operation. He looked south toward the distant lights of the Continental Pacific Survey Camp. He thought about the maps. The completed lines, the planned extensions, the 2,000-mile network that would, within 10 years, connect every part of this territory to every other part and make possible the movement of hundreds of thousands of people who currently had nothing and no way to get anywhere. He believed in that work. He had believed in it for 20 years, since a man named Robert Hartwell had pulled him from a burning warehouse in San Francisco, and he had lain in a recovery bed for 3 weeks thinking about what the rest of his life was supposed to be for. He had decided it was for this, for building the infrastructure that would make the West livable for people who could not currently get there. He had also decided, somewhere in those 20 years, that the work was important enough to proceed without asking the permission of every man whose particular piece of ground stood in its path. This was the conclusion of a man who had made peace with what he was doing. Aldrich was not troubled by his conscience. He had resolved his conscience and moved on, and the resolution had been so thorough that he genuinely felt, when he looked at those maps, only the satisfaction of a craftsman looking at something made well. He went back inside and took the senator back on like a coat. He shook Wade's hand near the punch bowl. "Callahan! I believe I knew a Thomas Callahan years back. Any relation?" "My father." "Good man. That accident was a genuine tragedy. I was sorry to hear it at the time." He moved on before anything else needed to be said. The timing of the dismissal was perfect. Wade stood with his punch cup and said nothing. Sam was there in a moment, materializing the way Sam had a talent for materializing when a man needed a steadying presence without a conversation. He put a hand briefly on Wade's shoulder. "Easy." That was all. Wade set the punch cup down and went outside to find some air. The missing accountant turned up on a Friday. Nell had spent 3 days building trust among the small rancher community in the valley, and one of the women, Clara Donahue's sister-in-law, who had stayed behind when the Donahue family sold out, had been bringing food to a line shack 6 miles east of Ogden. She told Nell about it quietly, in the yard behind the boarding house, with the careful manner of a woman who had decided that what she knew had been kept long enough. Jacob Reeves had been in that line shack for 2 months. He was 58 years old, thinner than any 58-year-old man had a right to be, with a leg wound that had healed badly from a fall on rocky ground while running in the dark 8 months ago. His evidence was intact. He had kept it wrapped in oilcloth in a tin box buried under the floor of the shack, and he produced it with the hands of a man who has been protecting something until the right moment, and is now satisfied the moment has arrived. The evidence was complete and devastating. The original forged documents, the genuine comparison set, the chain of authorizations, a collection of correspondence between continental Pacific shell companies that traced every decision back to the same source. Jacob explained the legal situation with the precision of a man who had had 2 months alone to think it through. To file the fraud charges in Territorial District Court and make them hold, the plaintiff needed to be the legal property owner of record for the affected parcels. The Hartwell land transfers were central to the case. The plaintiff needed to be Eleanor Hartwell, not an authorized representative, not an investigator, the owner herself, by name, in open court. Nell was quiet for a long moment. Wade watched her and waited. "Once I identify myself," she said, "Aldrich knows exactly where to aim. There is no more cover." She paused. "And Aldrich has enough influence with the Territorial Land Commissioner to file a doctrine of abandonment challenge. If he moves fast enough with that filing, he can argue that Hartwell Holdings forfeited its claims by failing to maintain active management after my father's death. The 3 years I managed the company in San Francisco would be characterized as nominal. A competent territorial attorney working for Aldrich could potentially win that argument." She looked at Wade. "Which would mean I could win the fraud case in court and still lose the land. Everything my father built, everything those families lost." The true weight of the choice was visible on her face for one moment. Not fear, not self-pity, just the clear-eyed accounting of a woman who had been keeping these books for 3 years and knew exactly what the numbers said. Then the moment passed, and her face was still again. "I will not let the Donahue family lose their land, and the Reyes family lose their land, and your father's land stay stolen because I decided to protect what is mine," she said. "I won't do that." Wade held her gaze for a long moment. "Then we do it," he said. "But we do it right. You don't do it alone." "Why are you still in this, Callahan?" He thought about it honestly. He thought about his father's signature on a deed that should never have been transferred, and about 23 other families, and about the particular image of Thomas Garrett at his fence line, working alone on ground where his wife was buried. "Because it's my business too," he said. That was the true answer. It was not the complete answer. They both knew this. Neither said anything more about it. They brought Jacob to Emma's boarding house, the back room she kept for guests who needed privacy, which she offered without questions or conditions, which was one of the reasons it was the safest place in Ogden. That evening, before Wade left, Nell said quietly, "When this is finished, however it finishes, Lot 47 comes back to your name. That land belongs to your family." He said nothing. She did not wait for a response. She went inside. He stood on the boarding house porch in the cooling dark, looking at the stars coming up over the Wasatch. He thought about next year. He had not thought about next year in a long time. It was a strange thing to find himself doing, standing on a porch in Ogden in September, and he was not entirely sure what to do with it. He rode back to the ranch. The stars were very bright, and the air was cold coming down off the mountains, and the valley below him was dark and still and full of things that had not yet been settled. The first plan failed before sunrise. They had put Jacob in Sam's wagon with a load of fence posts on top of the oilcloth box and sent him east toward Salt Lake City at midnight. The road through the canyon, which was the expected route, because taking the expected route sometimes worked if you moved fast enough and quiet enough, and nobody had been watching long enough to know your schedule. Somebody had been watching long enough. Two of Deering's men were on the canyon road at the first narrow. They did not stop the wagon. They did not need to stop it. They were simply there, visible in the moonlight. And their presence was the message. Sam turned the wagon around and brought Jacob back to Emma's house before dawn. First plan ended. Wade and Nell sat across from each other at Emma's kitchen table with coffee going cold between them. Sam stood against the wall. Jacob was in the back room sleeping. The fact that Deering's men had been on the canyon road meant Deering had known about the plan or had predicted it independently, which amounted to the same result. The expected route was covered. Any route that Deering's men could reach before dawn was potentially covered. The only route that was safe was one that Deering could not cover because he did not know it existed. They were replanning under pressure, with Deering already certain they were ready to move. That same night, at approximately 3 in the morning, the Triple Bar equipment barn burned. Wade was there inside 10 minutes with 4 ranch hands, and they got the fire contained before it reached the main stable. But the equipment barn was gone, the timber too dry from a summer without rain, the fire too far along before anyone smelled the smoke. They worked until dawn with wet sacking and bucket lines and saved everything attached to it. As the sun came up, Cole Deering rode up to the Triple Bar gate. He sat his horse at the fence line and studied the smoke rising from the ruin of the barn with the expression of a man who found the weather mildly interesting. "Hell of a thing," he said. Wade came to the fence. His shirt was wet and black at the cuffs from the bucket work, and there was ash in his hair. And he looked at Deering with the flat, steady regard of a man who had been awake all night doing hard work that should not have been necessary. Neither man looked away. "What do you want, Deering?" "I want the school teacher on a westbound train by Friday." Deering's voice was pleasant and specific. After that, the whole situation simplifies considerably for everyone involved. "And if she doesn't go?" Deering adjusted his hat brim against the morning sun. "Fire out here moves fast," he said, which was the same thing he had said about the weather, and he turned his horse and rode back toward town. Wade stood at the fence line and watched him go. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to find Nell and tell her to leave Ogden. She was at the boarding house. She listened to him lay it out. The barn, Deering at the fence, the specific Friday deadline, with her hands flat on the table and her face still. "No," she said. "Deering doesn't make empty threats. I understand that. There are people in this town who will be hurt if this continues. There are 23 families who have already been hurt," she said. Her voice did not rise. It had the quality of something that had been decided a long time ago and did not require force because it was simply true. "Thomas Garrett is trying to hold his fence line alone. Jacob Reeves spent 2 months in a line shack eating what a neighbor woman brought him. Your father died on his own land before he could defend it. I am not leaving Ogden." They looked at each other. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm afraid of several things," she said. "Leaving is not one of them." Something changed in his voice when he replied, the quality of it dropping half a register, losing the brisk practicality of a man giving tactical advice and becoming something else. "I don't want you to get hurt," he said, plain and direct and with no performance attached to it, which was the only way Wade Callahan said the things he actually meant. She recognized the difference. She had been listening to how he said things for 2 weeks. "Wade," she said. Just his name, for the first time without the last name attached. Nell. That was all that needed to be said. The understanding was mutual, and the silence that followed it was not uncomfortable. They were two people who did not reach for sentiment, when plain acknowledgement did the same work more cleanly. They were going to finish this. They both knew it. They would do it together. That was the whole thing. In the afternoon, while Wade was with Patterson's foreman assessing the barn damage and what it would cost to rebuild, Sam found Nell sitting on the water trough behind the stable. She was watching the last of the smoke dissipate over the tree line. Sam sat beside her the way Sam sat, without ceremony, without asking, with the ease of a man who had never experienced a space he did not feel comfortable occupying. They talked about nothing important for a while, the weather, the quality of Emma's coffee, whether the horses liked the new hay better than the old. Then Sam said, looking at a point in the middle distance, "You know how Wade and I came to know each other?" She said she did not. Sam told it the way he told everything, plain and without performance, the facts arranged in the order they had happened. After the war, he had been in bad shape. He had been in Ogden because he had no other destination. There was a group of men who had strong feelings about Confederates, particularly in the months after Appomattox, and they had expressed those feelings in an alley off Main Street one evening. Wade had come around the corner and assessed the situation. "Didn't ask what uniform I wore," Sam said. "Didn't ask which side I fought for. Didn't ask why I was in that alley or what I'd done or hadn't done. Just saw a man who needed a hand up." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the whole man, right there in that one thing. Everything else about him is just details hanging off that one fact." Nell said nothing, but something settled in her. The particular quality of a woman who has been carefully assembling evidence about a person and has just been given the piece that makes the picture complete. That evening in room 6 of the Ogden Hotel, Cole Deering sat in a chair beside the window with a glass of whiskey on the sill and a photograph in his hands. The photograph was worn at the edges from being handled. Deering looked at it for a long time with an expression that was difficult to read because it had several things in it at once. The expression of a man whose code was under pressure from a direction he had not expected. He put the photograph back in his breast pocket. He drank the whiskey. He looked at the ceiling. He had taken Aldrich's contract because the money was right, and because Aldrich had the kind of power that was worth having on your side. He had done the work that was asked of him, the watching, the warning, the burning, because those things were within the lines of what Cole Deering was willing to do. There were other lines. He had not crossed them yet. He did not yet know if he was going to be asked to. He poured another whiskey. Around Emma Cross's kitchen table, Wade and Sam and Nell laid out the second plan. Jacob and the evidence needed to reach Salt Lake City and be placed before Judge Arthur Hale, the only territorial district judge Aldrich had not found a way to reach, a man Jacob knew personally from land title work in the 1860s and trusted completely. The canyon road was covered. Any road that appeared on a survey map was potentially watched. Sam knew a trail through the northern pass, rough going in the dark, steep enough that Deering's men would not expect anyone to use it with a sick man and a wagon full of evidence. The plan: Nell and Jacob take the north trail at 3 in the morning. Wade and Sam create a disturbance in town to hold Deering's attention on the wrong end of the valley. Emma appeared at the kitchen doorway as the others were finishing the details. She looked at the table with the assessment of a woman who had been present at this kind of conversation many times and knew what it looked like. She waited until Sam and Nell had gone to prepare. "Who is she to you?" Emma asked. "She's the right person in the wrong place at the wrong time." "That is not what I asked." He did not answer. Emma nodded. She had known the answer longer than he had. "Don't protect her because you love her," she said. "Let her be what she is. Love her for that." "You make it sound straightforward." "Love is straightforward. People are the complicated part." She went back to the kitchen. Wade sat alone at the table for a while. Then he went to saddle his horse. 3 in the morning, and the valley was cold and dark under a quarter moon. Nell and Jacob went east through the back pasture, picking up the north trail at the fence line Sam had shown Nell that afternoon on a hand-sketched map. The trail climbed fast through scrub pine and loose shale, rough going even in daylight, and Jacob moved slowly on account of his leg. They went at the speed they could manage and did not try to go faster. Wade and Sam rode into Ogden from the south and tied their horses outside the saloon. The noise they created was the kind of noise that made Cole Deering's name come up twice within the first 5 minutes. A disagreement about a card game from 3 days ago, suddenly renewed with considerable volume, involving 3 other men who had been briefed earlier that evening, and who performed their parts with the conviction of men who genuinely enjoyed a legitimate reason to argue. Deering appeared at the saloon door inside 10 minutes. Alone, no men with him. Wade registered this fact the way a soldier registered the absence of expected enemy fire, as information more alarming than the fire itself. Deering's men were not here because Deering had already sent them somewhere else. Somewhere he expected the problem to be. He figured the trail, Wade said quietly to Sam. Sam was already moving. They went out the saloon's back door and ran for their horses. On the north trail, an hour into the climb, 3 riders came out of the timber above the switchback and blocked the path. They were not Ogden men. They were company men, brought in from elsewhere, the kind of men who moved with the particular organized efficiency of people who had done this sort of work before and were not troubled by it. Nell had a revolver. She had owned it for 8 years, had practiced with it for 7, and had hoped for most of those years never to use it in a situation like this one. She was calculating the 3-to-2 problem, herself and a man who could not move fast, when the mathematics changed. A figure dropped from the rock face above the trail, landing on the shale slope 10 feet to the right of the lead rider, and the lead rider's horse shied hard and threw the calculation into disorder. Jacob saw the figure in the moonlight and went rigid. Roy Calloway was 44 years old and had been officially dead for 8 months and looked it slightly. Thinner than a Pinkerton agent had any business being, with the worn, watchful quality of a man who had been living outdoors for a long time and was no longer troubled by the inconvenience. He had been reported killed in a robbery in January. His body had never been found. His former colleague, Cole Deering, had arranged both of these circumstances, and Roy had been watching Deering from a safe distance ever since, waiting for the right moment to become useful. "I owe Deering a conversation," Roy said to no one in particular. "I am not dead before I have it." What followed was brief and decisive. Roy from the high ground, Nell from the trail, and the 3 company men rearranged from obstacle to problem into 1 man riding hard back toward town with a message, and 2 men sitting in the dirt with their hands behind their heads. When it was over, Nell stood in the trail with the revolver at her side, and her hands were steady. Not the steadiness of someone controlling a response. The steadiness of someone who had done what the situation required and had not been surprised by their own ability to do it. Jacob sat against a boulder looking at Roy Calloway with the expression of a man encountering something he had filed under permanently impossible. "They said you were dead," Jacob said. "They were wrong," Roy said, and began building a small fire with the efficiency of a man for whom this was domestic. Wade and Sam arrived 40 minutes later, having pushed their horses hard up the trail. Wade came around the last switchback and took in the scene. 2 disarmed men sitting in the shale, Jacob against the boulder, Roy Calloway feeding a fire, and Nell standing in the trail with the revolver still in her hand, looking at the dark timber above the path. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I told you," he said. "I know what you told me." Something in his voice that was not argument and was not entirely surprise either. Something closer to recognition. He had told her she could handle it. He had believed it when he said it. The belief had been confirmed, and the confirmation did something to the quality of the air between them. They could not continue to Salt Lake City on this trail in the dark with the possibility of more company men at higher elevations. Roy knew a line shack half a mile east through the timber, a place he had occupied for the past 8 months and had made reasonably habitable through the application of resourcefulness and time. They went. The shack was small and low and smelled of wood smoke, and the peculiar solitude of a space one man had lived in alone for a long season. Jacob was given the cot. Sam took the first watch outside. Roy cleaned his rifle by the door with the methodical attention of a man for whom maintenance was its own kind of comfort. Wade and Nell sat by the fire. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was full. The particular fullness of silence between two people who have been through something together and are now in the aftermath of it, when the urgency is gone and what remains is the thing underneath the urgency. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell," she said. He looked at her. "I own Hartwell Holdings. Legal title to approximately 40% of the land parcels in this valley and the surrounding range." She met his eyes. "Including the parcel that shares a boundary line with your father's land. Including Lot 47. The fire moved between them. "When did you know?" "When I saw your father's name on Patterson's list. I cross-referenced the boundary line on my map. The same authorizing name, the same method, the same 18-month window." She was quiet for a moment. "The same man who destroyed my father's holdings, destroyed your father's land. Their properties were adjacent. They never met." The fire popped and settled. Outside, Sam's boots moved on the shale as he made his slow circuit of the shack's perimeter. "And you didn't say?" "No." She looked at the fire. "I did not know how to say it. And I was afraid you would think that your father's land was to me only another line in a property inventory. One more parcel in a list of 41. She paused. "It was not that." Wade stood up. He walked to the cabin door and stood in the opening, looking at the dark mountain and the stars very close overhead, the way stars were at elevation, as if the air itself had thinned enough to bring them nearer. He thought about his father. He thought about a kitchen table and a folded deed, and a man pressing it into his son's hands with the expression of a man who believed in being prepared for things he did not believe were going to happen. He thought about the September morning when he had stood on the Triple Bar stable roof and watched the Union Pacific cut through the valley, and had known approximately where his father's land was and had never gone to look. He turned back into the cabin. "You were right not to tell me before now," he said. "I would have reacted wrong." She looked at him steadily. "You're not reacting wrong now?" "Yes, but I know why." He came back and sat down across the fire from her. "It doesn't change what you did or why you did it. You came here alone to find justice for a man who worked for your father. And you found it, and you are going to stand in open court and put your name on it and lose whatever you lose. That is not a small thing." She was quiet. "I know what it cost," he said. "My father knew too. He said no to a man who killed him for it." The fire between them was low and warm, and the shack was quiet around them. They sat in it for a long time, and neither of them said anything further, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and the rest of it was in the silence, and they both knew that too. Salt Lake City was larger and louder than Ogden, and smelled of industry and money, and the particular ambition of a place that understood it was becoming important, and was not yet sure how to carry the weight of it. Judge Arthur Hale had been on the territorial bench since 1866, and had the manner of a man who had heard enough nonsense in that time to recognize it at considerable range. He was 60 years old, spare and gray, and he kept his courtroom with the quiet authority of a man who did not need to raise his voice, because people in his courtroom had learned that they would regret making him raise it. Jacob Reeves presented the documentary evidence over the course of 4 hours on a Wednesday morning in October of 1878. He was methodical and precise and answered questions from the court with the measured accuracy of a man who had spent 20 years making sure his numbers were right before he reported them. The forged transfers, the genuine comparison documents, the correspondence between Continental Pacific shell companies, the chain of authorization signatures, all of it organized, all of it cross-referenced, all of it pointing in the same direction. Nell stood when called and identified herself in the formal language of the court. "Eleanor Hartwell, sole principal of Hartwell Holdings, legal title holder of record for the affected land parcels in the northern Utah and Wyoming territories. Plaintiff, her real name, her real identity. No more Nell Harper from Denver. No more school teacher's cover. Just herself, in a room full of people standing on the ground of who she actually was. Wade sat beside her at the plaintiff's table and watched the room and said nothing. Aldrich's legal team occupied the defendant's table with the composed professionalism of men who were very well paid and knew it. Their lead attorney was a man named Graves, who had argued before the territorial court 17 times and lost twice, and he had the particular assurance of someone who knew his own record well. When Jacob finished his presentation, Graves stood up. He presented a counterfiling. A series of voluntary land transfer agreements, he explained, bearing Miss Hartwell's signature, executed in her capacity as principal of Hartwell Holdings, conveying portions of the company's holdings to Continental Pacific in exchange for railroad construction and development contracts. If these agreements were valid, they substantially altered Miss Hartwell's standing as an aggrieved party. He called his witness to confirm the agreements. Marcus Webb walked into the courtroom. He was 45 years old and wearing a good suit, and he looked at the room with the steady composure of a man who had prepared thoroughly for this moment. He did not look at Nell. Nell went still. Not the stillness of her strategy and calculation. The other kind. The stillness of someone who has been hit in a place they did not know was exposed. Wade was watching her face, and he saw it. Not the external expression, which barely changed, but the quality underneath it, the specific texture of the stillness. He did not speak. He placed his hand on the table beside hers, not touching, just present. The only thing available to offer in a room full of people where nothing more was possible. She registered it. He saw her register it. Webb explained in a calm and organized voice that he had executed the transfer agreements in his capacity as operational manager of Hartwell Holdings under an emergency business authority provision in the company charter designed for exactly the situation where the principal was absent and time-sensitive business decisions required action. He had judged the agreements to be in the company's best interest given the circumstances. The documents looked correct. The signatures looked correct. Because Webb had 3 years of Nell's genuine signature on hundreds of legitimate documents, and a man who had been planning this for long enough had learned what he needed to learn. From the back of the courtroom, a chair moved. Roy Calloway stood up. He was still wearing the same coat he had worn on the North Pass, which had not improved in the interval. He was holding a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth. "Your Honor," he said, "I have something to add to this proceeding." He walked to the front of the courtroom and placed the bundle on the clerk's table. He explained what it contained in the plain voice of a man reciting facts. 14 months of correspondence between Marcus Webb and Senator Grove Aldrich. Specific, detailed, direct. Aldrich instructing Webb on the mechanics of the forged transfers, the timing, the legal provisions to use, the language designed to make the forgeries hold up under casual review. "A forged signature invalidates any transfer executed under it," Roy said. "That is territorial law, and it predates this railroad by 30 years. He looked at Judge Hale. "But these letters establish a conspiracy to commit fraud against a legal property owner. Both questions belong before this court." Webb stood up from the witness chair and walked toward the courtroom door. Sam Briggs was leaning against it with his arms crossed, watching Webb come toward him with the pleasant expression of a man who has been waiting for something and is not surprised it has arrived. "Where are you headed, friend?" Sam said. In the corridor outside, Aldrich was being secured by 2 territorial court officers. He moved with the dignity of a man who understood that this was happening and had decided that his conduct in the aftermath would be the last performance he gave, and he intended to give it well. He paused beside Wade as the officers took his arms. "Your father was a stubborn man," Aldrich said. His voice was even, not apologetic, the tone of a man acknowledging a fact. "You killed him," Wade said. "He refused a reasonable offer. And the kind of work I was doing, that has costs." He said it the way he said everything about the railroad, with the flat certainty of a man who had made peace with the accounting long ago. The officers moved him on. Sam stood beside Wade in the corridor. He said nothing. He was just there, which was the whole of what was needed. "He'll face the court," Wade said quietly. It was not said to Sam. It was said to the space where his father's name had been, to the land office record, and the headstone and the 3 weeks between them. That's how it should go. Judge Hale asked Wade to remain when the others had cleared the room. The judge was a spare man, and he did spare things. He handed Wade an envelope without ceremony and said it had been found in Aldrich's personal safe during the evidentiary search, and the name on the outside was Wade's. Wade opened it at the courtroom table. The original deed to Lot 47, North Range, Wyoming. His father's signature at the bottom. Careful, deliberate. The signature of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse and understood that letters mattered and treated each one accordingly. The transfer line was blank, no countersignature. No grantee, unsigned. Below the deed, written separately in a different hand. Aldrich's handwriting, meticulous as everything Aldrich did. Dated April 1st, 1873. T period, C period, refuses period, handle it period. His father had died 2 days later, on April 3rd. He had never sold. They had taken his life before he could be made to sign. Wade read the notation twice. He folded the deed carefully and placed it inside his shirt pocket against his chest. He stood up. He walked out into the corridor. Nell was there. She looked at his face. She had been watching his face for 2 months, and she had learned what it said when it said nothing. She did not need to be told what was in the envelope. She stepped forward and stood in front of him, close, not touching. "Wade?" "I haven't cried since Chickamauga," he said. It came out quiet and plain, the way he said true things. Like a fact about the geography of himself, something he was reporting rather than lamenting. She stood in front of him and said nothing. He lowered his head once. His shoulders moved once with something that had been held for a long time and was now released. Then he straightened. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He took one long breath. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't do anything. You were here." He looked at her. "That is the whole thing." Early morning. The Salt Lake City courthouse steps were empty, and the sun was not yet above the eastern mountains, and the air had the clean, cold quality of high altitude before the day warmed it. Wade sat alone on the steps with the deed in his hands. He read his father's signature one more time. The careful, deliberate letters. The name of a man who had farmed 30 acres of Wyoming range for 30 years and had died rather than sign it away. He folded the deed and put it back inside his shirt, against his chest. He would carry it there until he was standing on that ground. Some things were worth carrying. The territorial court proceedings took 3 weeks. Grove Aldrich was held in the Salt Lake City Territorial Jail, in the custody of the territorial marshal, pending the full hearing of the charges against him. The charges, land fraud, conspiracy, and complicity in the death of Thomas Callahan, among others documented in Jacob's evidence, would occupy the territorial court for months and possibly longer. Aldrich would face that court with the same composed dignity with which he had been secured, and the court would return a verdict based on the evidence, and the evidence was thorough and complete, and signed in Aldrich's own hand in 14 months of correspondence. That was how it should go. Marcus Webb cooperated with the territorial prosecution in exchange for the court's consideration of his circumstances. His testimony closed every remaining gap in the case. His cooperation did not exempt him from accountability. He would stand before the county court in his own time for his own offenses, but it ended Aldrich's ability to maneuver within the proceedings, and the last nail was the last nail, regardless of who drove it. Continental Pacific Holdings was ordered to restore clear title or provide full compensation to 23 families. The territorial court appointed an independent commissioner to oversee the process, which took the matter out of Aldrich's reach entirely. The Donahue family came back from wherever they had gone. They walked their land again in November with their 3 children, and the Continental Pacific Survey stakes were gone, and the ground was theirs. The Reyes family was located in New Mexico. They were given the choice. They came back. Thomas Garrett kept his land. He hired a new hand in October, a young man from Wyoming looking for work, and the fence line that had come down in the wind was properly repaired, and the ground was ready for spring. Cole Deering presented himself to Judge Hale in the week after the initial hearing, with full documentation of Aldrich's operational methods and the specific orders Deering had received and carried out. He offered this information in exchange for the court's leniency. He was remanded to the Salt Lake County Jail pending sentencing, not hanged, which was arguably more than his conduct warranted and less comfortable than he had hoped for. A code of honor at the end was still a code, even when it arrived late and cost you everything you had tried to avoid paying. Roy Calloway received a formal letter from Judge Hale exonerating him. His name was cleared, his death corrected to living in the official record, his Pinkerton credentials restored on paper, though he did not appear to want them. He rode north alone the morning after the exoneration, the way a man rode who had been moving long enough that stopping felt unnatural. He shook Wade's hand before he left. "Did you get her?" "Not yet." "You will." "How do you know that?" "Because she asked me about you. A woman who was not coming back would not bother asking." He laughed, brief and genuine, and got on his horse and rode north, and was gone. Wade stood on his father's land for the first time in 6 years. Sam stood beside him and had the considerable good sense not to talk. The October light was flat and clear over the Wyoming range, the grass dry and pale, the mountains showing their first snow at the high elevations. The land was unremarkable in the way that all working ground was unremarkable. It did not announce itself, did not justify its worth through beauty. It was ground. It was his father's ground. It was his. He walked to the center of the parcel and crouched down and picked up a handful of the earth. He let it run through his fingers slowly, watching it fall. He stood up. Sam was still quiet. "What are you going to do with it?" Sam asked, after the silence had been long enough. "Don't know yet, but it's mine." "That's enough for today," Sam said. It was. It was exactly enough for today. The night before Nell left for San Francisco, Emma organized a table at the boarding house. Not a celebration, a meal. Bread from the oven, beef stew, strong coffee. Wade and Nell and Sam and Jacob, who was walking better on his leg now that he had been eating properly for 3 weeks, and Thomas Garrett, who had come in from his ranch for the occasion and sat at the table with the quiet contentment of a man who had kept what was his. Emma sat at the head and looked at the people around her table with 67 years of reading rooms behind her eyes. "Most people come through this town running from something," she said. "Fewer come running towards something, and fewer still stay long enough to build anything." She looked at Nell, then at Wade. "You both came here chasing the past. See if you cannot manage to stay for what comes after it." She passed the bread. The conversation moved to ordinary things, and the ordinary things were fine. The next morning, Wade found Nell at Lot 47. She had come without being asked, without invitation, which meant she had come because she wanted to be there, and that was information. She was sitting in the dry grass, looking out across the valley, her leather satchel beside her, the early November light making everything pale and clear. He sat down beside her without announcement. 2 months, she said, maybe 3. There is a great deal to resolve in San Francisco. I know. When I come back... She stopped. She started over. If I come back... Nell, you do not know what I am like when there is nothing to fight. I may be entirely dull. I read legal contracts before sleeping. I cannot cook anything that does not involve burning it at least once. I have never successfully kept a houseplant alive. He looked at her steadily. I can cook. I do not read contracts, but I will listen while you talk about them. and I have not found you dull for a single day of our acquaintance. You know me only in a crisis. I know you rode into a town where you knew no one, and no one knew your real name. And you did it alone to find justice for a man who worked for your father. I know when you are frightened you stand straighter instead of smaller. I know the children at Triple Bar asked Emma if the school teacher was coming back. He looked at her. That is not a small amount of knowing. The wind moved through the dry grass on Lot 47 North Range, and the valley spread below them in the November light. And somewhere under the soil his father had worked this same ground for 30 years. I will come back, she said. I will be here. You are very certain. I am certain about my part of it. The rest is yours. Sam told Wade he was staying. He said it the next morning in the stable while they were seeing to the horses, without sentiment, with the plain finality of a man who had made his decision and was ready to start the next day's work. You have gone soft, Wade told him. Man is entitled, Sam said. That evening, Emma found Wade on the boarding house porch watching the last light leave the valley. She sat beside him the way she did everything, without ceremony, without explanation, as if she had always been planning to be there. She will come back, Emma said. I know. You are different than when she arrived. He considered this. It was true. He had come to Ogden 2 years ago and arranged his life around having no future, and he had done it deliberately and with commitment, and it had worked fine for 2 years. And now he was thinking about next year and the year after that and what Lot 47 would look like in spring, with the fence line properly established and something growing in the south field. I started thinking about next year, he said. Emma nodded. That is how it starts, she said. She went inside. The porch was quiet. 6 months later. Spring of 1879, and the valley below Ogden was green from the late snowmelt, and the Wasatch had lost its winter white down to the high peaks, and a Tuesday afternoon in April had the particular quality of light that came when a long winter was genuinely finished. Wade stood on the platform at Ogden Station with his hat in his hands. Sam stood 15 feet behind him, deeply occupied with examining a fence post that was not there, his jaw working against something he was losing the battle with. The Union Pacific came in from the west and slowed and hissed and stopped, and the platform filled with the ordinary movement of passengers and freight and mail. Nell stepped off the last car. Dark blue coat. Hair back. Leather satchel in hand. She looked at first glance exactly like the woman who had arrived at this station in September and stood on the wrong side of the tracks while a train came at her. At second glance, she was walking differently. Not more carefully, more deliberately. The walk of a woman who knew where she was going and had already decided she was not stopping until she arrived. She walked directly to Wade. She stopped 1 step from him. I am back, she said. I see that. You are not going to ask how it went. I know you would not have come back until it was finished. In a long look between them. Then she set the leather satchel down on the platform boards and took the last step. Wade Callahan. I thought about you every day for 6 months. I know. You are very certain. I thought about you every day, too. He took her hand. He looked down at it for a moment. The small calluses that had not been there in September, the evidence of everything she had chosen and done and stayed for, everything visible. I intend to keep doing it. Sam turned fully away from both of them and directed his entire attention at the northern hills, where nothing in particular was happening, and where he studied the nothing with fierce concentration and did not succeed in the thing he was trying not to do with his face. On the North Hill above Ogden, on a parcel of land that had taken 6 years and 1 long winter to come back to the man whose father had farmed it, the first fence posts of a new boundary line were going into the ground. Not Continental Pacific's fence, not a railroad company's claim, a man's fence, built around what he intended to keep. The land had waited long enough, so had he.